I'd just like to briefly introduce myself. We're coming to you from Darwin, the Northern Territory of Australia. I'm Dr. Steve Reynolds. I'm a lecturer and researcher here at Darwin University, and I'm a zoologist. My main interest is actually in amphibians, but I work on ecology and also physiology, so ecophysiology, and of course I have an interest in biogeography because of the region we're in Australia, particularly close to Southeast Asia, and also have a bit of interest in taxonomy. And I'd also like to introduce...
Yep, I'm Professor Keith Christian. I'm a zoologist here, also a zoologist here at Darwin University. My research interests are with amphibians and reptiles, the physiology and ecology, but of course evolution is the background for all of that, and it's sort of the backbone of all the research we do. I've had a long-standing interest in Darwin and evolution. In fact, I did my PhD research work in the Galapagos Islands way back in the late 1970s. And so I'm really pleased to be here and help see that today.
Okay, so as most of you hopefully have realised by now, the course is really composed of 4 parts. So hopefully you've had a little bit of a look around the site, and particularly noted part 1 this week. So what we'll do with the webinars is each Friday we'll have a webinar and we'll focus on that part. So this week we're going to focus on part 1. At the end of next week on Friday we'll focus on part 2, and so on. So this week obviously we want to talk about the life of Charles Darwin. So with the webinars, so a few things we'd like to do. Firstly, just talk about some points of interest relating to part 1. So hopefully you've already read through part 1 on the quiz and so on, and we'll just cover some other points of interest, maybe some things we didn't cover necessarily in part 1. We also want to provide some opportunities to interact and participate. So we'll have some questions, so you can respond to those questions with polling, and also a bit of live chat, so you can send us some chat at any time, and we'll be monitoring that during the webinar. So, and the other thing we'd like to do is that we've had some discussions on the discussion forum this week, and we'd like to look at some of the items and some of the issues and so on and come out of that discussion forum. So, just while we're on that, so hopefully, I think most people have figured this out already, but you can communicate using the chat, and so use the chat box there to write anything and press enter when you want to send a bit of chat, and we'll keep an eye on that. The other thing is for the polling, so what we'll do is we'll have a couple of questions, some activities during the webinar, and to participate, go to the box. So you can see here, there's a menu and there's a polling response box there. And actually most of ours will be multiple choice, so A, B, C or A, B, C, D. So give us your response. We'll give you a little bit of time to respond, and then we'll publish the responses to see what people think. All right. So what have we covered this week? So hopefully people have looked at the timeline. So we've had Darwin's life, his early life, the voyage of the Beagle, travelling around the world, and also when he came back from his journey. We've also had some readings from the Journal of Researchers. So part of that is fossil megafauna that Darwin found, but also his description of the Galapagos, so the islands, the landscapes, and some of the animals and so on. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Galapagos in part 2, so next week. And the other thing is the Beagle voyages and how Port Darwin and Darwin, where we are, came to be named. So hopefully everyone's had a look at that. One thing we just wanted to say was that there's a lot of books available on Darwin. One that I would particularly recommend is this one, which is Charles Darwin, part of the Very Interesting People series. So he was a very interesting person, and it's written by Adrian Desmond, James Moore, and Janet Brown. So they're all very well-renowned Darwin scholars. So for a short, readable introduction, and this one is interesting in terms of a lot of the social context as well to what was happening at the time in England. I definitely recommend this one. It's easy to get hold of. You can just order it online or whatever. Okay, you have
Yep, I'd like to recommend one, a different one that's different but similar in some ways. Also very concise. In fact, it's so concise that it has concise in the title. The title is Charles Darwin, The Concise Story of an Extraordinary Man, and that's by Professor Tim Berra. And Tim Berra is at Ohio State University. But he spent quite a bit of time here in Darwin, both at the museum in Darwin and more recently at the Charles Darwin University. So it's a good overview, very readable, lots of nice illustrations and pictures, and so it's a very good way to get a lot of information about Darwin very quickly.
And Tim gives an interesting lecture on Charles Darwin as well, which is available online. You can find that, and there's a link to it on the MOOC. So we thought we would start, so we want to test out the polling. So what we would like is, the question is...
Can you repeat the author?
Oh, so we've got a question here.
Okay, I'll repeat the concise story of an extraordinary man, Tim Berra, B-E-R-R-A, B-E-R-R-A.
Yeah.
I think maybe they're asking about both of them.
I'm asking about this one as well. This one is just called Charles Darwin by Adrian Desmond, James Moore and Janet Brown. And it's part of the very interesting People series by Oxford University Press. So it's published in England by Oxford University Press. Alright, so we'll try out the first poll. So this is just sort of a general question about Darwin. I guess in a way, if you thought, if I was Darwin, which part of his life do you think would appeal to the most, which would be the most interesting or exciting, which would interest you? So Darwin lived for quite a while. He lived until he was 73 years old. The voyage was an important part in the middle there, 5 years from 1831 to 1836. So really, which period of Darwin's life do you think? Would you, rather be out adventuring in South America, or would you be sort of like to be comfortable down the house? Or maybe his early life was quite interesting. So people have made some votes. We'll give you a few more seconds. So 5-second warning. Oh, the timer's timed out. 4, 3. Okay, so let's see what people thought. So there's some responses. So we've got, what have we got? Looks like the Beagle's done pretty well. Yeah. So a few people like the early life. Well, okay. I think, so this is, so Darwin obviously went to Edinburgh and sort of tried to study there for a while, and then this is Cambridge, and we can actually see Darwin's room up here, where he stayed at Cambridge. I think he had a fairly probably enjoyable time there. He didn't have to study too hard, really. Would have been quite a comfortable guy. He learned a few things. I think he met Henslow, so that would have been definitely influential. And I think maybe it's a period when he started to collect beetles and so on, and natural history actually started to become a pursuit. He realised it was a thing that he was really interested in, and I think he finally recognised that. So in a way, it would have been a nice time of his life. So a lot of people have said the voyage. I think the voyage would have been interesting, but I guess I'd like to point out that Darwin was stuck in this little cabin for most of the voyage, and it didn't have a lot of room. He could barely stand up in it because it was, had low ceilings under the poop deck. He had to share it with 2 other people, sleep in his hammock at night, and then that's where he did a lot of his reading and so on. And the cabin didn't have a window or anything like that. I think it would have been interesting for him, but there were certain privations.
Yep. Another aspect of the voyage for Darwin was that he was seasick pretty much the whole time. A lot of people get seasick early in the voyage, and then they get used to it. And sort of get over it.
Yeah.
He never got over it, so I think he spent a lot of time feeling pretty miserable on that time. But there was a positive aspect to that, and that was that he took the opportunity to get off the Beagle every chance he had.
Yeah.
And he spent quite a bit of time, particularly in South America, traveling overland by horseback, hired horses or borrowed horses, and he would arrange to meet the people that are maybe in a different port or maybe at the same port at a different time. And he actually spent weeks and weeks, and in some cases even months, traveling around. And of course, this is when he did made a lot of observations, did a lot of his collecting plants and animals and rocks. So he did geology, botany, and zoology. And he also witnessed a lot of things. He saw a volcano erupting in South America, and he witnessed quite a large earthquake. And so these were all really important events that he would have missed out on if he sort of stayed on the Beagle.
Stayed at home.
Or either stayed at home or stayed on the Beagle.
Yeah. So, and I think the other thing I put in, this is an example of the sorts of things that people used to do on ships in those days. This is a ship in a bottle. And these things are very hard to create. They're very meticulous. They take very long periods of time. And one thing he had on the voyage was lots of time to think and to read and to do lots of stuff. It took, particularly if you think about the days of sailing, voyages took a really long time. So he had all that time on the voyage just to, think about things and ponder and read and do all that sort of stuff. So I think that was pretty important time and would have been really interesting for him. And here we can see how he travelled around the world. And as Keith mentioned, he went to a lot of places, experienced a lot of things. And something else we point out here is the Galapagos. So that was obviously very important. But also there's one other place that, he did visit Australia down here, and he did visit New Zealand, but
yeah, he never actually made it to the tropical Australia, to where Darwin City is, and that was of course the Port Darwin, or the harbour of Darwin, was named in his honour. On the subsequent voyage, there was still a lot of the same crew, and the surveyor on that crew was named Stokes, and he actually named Darwin Harbour in honour of Darwin. And of course, there are a lot of places around Darwin Harbour that are named. There's a Stokes Hill Wharf, I think there's a Stokes, there's a Wickham.
There's a Charles Point, I think, which is also named after Darwin.
There's a Bino Harbour. All of those are people that were on the Beagle. So there's quite a bit of legacy, and we'll talk more about that legacy in part 4.
Yeah. So Darwin did go to Sydney here and to Tasmania and to King George's Sound down the bottom in southwestern Australia. But yeah, that voyage of the Beagle didn't go anywhere near northern Australia. And really there wasn't probably a lot, no real settlements or anything up in northern Australia at that time anyway. So then Darwin really spent the rest of his life at Down House. And I think, that was probably would have been reasonably comfortable there. He had everything he needed. He had his family, spent time with his children. He could go for walks in the country. And there was a country landed entry. He could spend time reading and pondering and writing letters and writing books as well. So I think that would have been a fairly comfortable time, and they were reasonably well off. Nice big house. I don't think life would have been terribly hard for him. So in a way, that period would have been quite good too. So, and next question then. So thinking more about really the theory in terms of evolutionary theory, natural selection, these ideas of divergence and so on. Again, thinking about these 3 periods of his life, early life, the voyage, so he's exploring the world and so on, geologizing, botanizing, all those sorts of things that he did. And then after the voyage, so when he's actually publishing, thinking a lot and writing, corresponding with everybody, and people all around the world, and he wrote, literally thousands of letters. So what do people think in terms of actually the development of his theory, or theories really, because of sexual selection and the other things as well. So he developed a whole body of knowledge, really. What do people think in terms of which period there would be most important? And so we've got some responses, so we give the 5-second warning. Most people 5, 4, 3, 2, oh, there you go. Pollen's timed out. So let's see what people thought about that.
Yeah, well, obviously there's no right or wrong answer to all of that. I mean, his early life sort of prepared him for the voyage. I mean, he didn't just go as a passenger. He was selected to go as the naturalist, so he had to have some preparation for that, so it's upbringing. And then, of course, the voyage was really, when he saw the world and all the diversity of plants and animals in the world and the geology. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, I think so. The voyage was obviously important. I think this is a quote from his autobiography, and that's when he said, "The voyage has been the most important event in my life, and this is in my whole career." So, but yeah, I mean, in order to get there, he had to recommend him. So I guess in a way you could say that was pretty important, and he has some education at Cambridge. But he says the real training and education of my mind happened during the voyage. So he got some education at Cambridge, but obviously it wasn't enough. And also, so he talks about several branches of natural history, so botanising, geologising, as we mentioned. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about he mentions there about his powers of observations. And this next slide is from the cabinet at Down House, and they have some examples there of some things. Here's a copy of the Principles of Geology, so Lyell's Principles, which Darwin read on the voyage, and then received the other volumes as he was travelling around, so that was very important. He spent a lot of time reading that. So that would be important. There's Darwin's dissecting instruments down here. So, he had his tweezers and he had his little scalpels and so on, so he'd actually get specimens and dissect them and then look at things very closely. He had this little device here, which is kind of neat, which is a pocket microscope. And there's its case. And on the top here is a little magnifying glass, and then here you can put your specimen on the little ledge there, and you could get specimens and look at them in the field and so on. So that was really handy. And he also had things, telescopes, so he could keep an eye out. So he had, and he, as he said, it really helped develop his observational skills, and he really became a naturalist. And not only that, a well-travelled naturalist, one that knew a lot about other places in the world from experience, not just from reading it somewhere, but actually from experience. Lastly, Down House. So I guess that was fairly important. So this is the sandwalk, so Darwin's thinking path. So we used to wander around it, walk around it several times, and ponder on various things.
So obviously this part of his life was really important. I mean, it's not as if on the voyage he had an epiphany and all of a sudden he thought about evolution by natural selection. It was very much a gradual process. He gathered information, he found out lots of things, he saw lots of things on the voyage, but it was only about 18 months or 2 years after he returned from the voyage that he first wrote something about his initial thoughts about evolution, or we call it transmutation. Transmutation. What he was talking about was evolution. So that came a year and a half or 2 years later. And it was really another, I think, about 7 years before he started writing about the mechanism of that is evolution by natural selection. So his time walking around the sand path and thinking, obviously, and doing experiments on initially a lot of things. Well, initially, a lot of he worked on the materials that he brought back from the voyage, but then he started working on barnacles and then later plants and pigeons and all sorts of other animals. But so it was really very much a gradual process, and he was I think he really wanted to have a lot of evidence before he put it forward, and so he spent 20 years really getting accumulating evidence. That's right. So yeah, he had lots of time to think and to
write. He had his study set up so he could write all his letters, his correspondence, as I mentioned, thousands of letters over those periods. So that was a time when he was really bringing all that information together. And it's just amazing to me the number of publications he had, all that information that he put into those publications. Like, how did he order it? How did he keep it all together so he knew it? He must have had a really good filing system, or and got an amazing brain to just remember all these little individual details that he put in, all these little bits of evidence.
Well, he didn't have a word processor.
Well, he didn't have a filing system on his computer or something like that. I mean, he just, it was all on pieces of paper, and so yeah, it's just amazing that he really managed to all that, such a diverse array of information and evidence that he brought together. Really, really impressive. So I think that's pretty important. Now, one thing that we hadn't really mentioned was Darwin's illness, and Darwin did have, and so this was really that period when he came back and was living at Down House, and he had really serious health issues for many, many years, and all these symptoms. He had terrible trouble, feeling really sick, and he tried various treatments and so on.
There's been a lot of speculation about what that illness was, and he first became ill on a couple of those overland voyages, one in Argentina and then I think again in Brazil. He got quite sick, and so that bug that was on the last slide is a bug called the assassin bug, or it's got a couple of different names. It's a bug. It's a blood-sucking bug that attacks people in South America, usually when they're at night, when they're sleeping, sucks their blood, and it transmits a protozoan that causes a disease called Chagas disease. The protozoan is called the trypanosoma. And like a lot of the protozoan diseases, they can be very persistent, like malaria. It can last a lifetime. And Chagas disease is one of those sort of lifelong illnesses. So some people think it may have been Chagas disease, but not everybody's convinced, because the symptoms are, that disease has a variety of symptoms, but it's not a clear-cut case. Yeah, there's definitely Chagas disease. It's sort of like that, but not necessarily. So other people have speculated that his illness was really related to stress, related to his controversial ideas. In other words, he was sort of dreading the backlash that might come, and to some extent did come during his lifetime. And so maybe that may have just been stress. And then there's a third line of thought, is that it was self-induced because of his desire to be left alone. In other words, just he wanted to stay at Down House. He really didn't want to be in the limelight, do his work, stay with his family. He was very much a family man. And so I don't think anybody was suggesting that he was faking it. And as Tim Barrett points out in his book, that these are not mutually exclusive. And so he may well have had some tropical Chagas disease or some other tropical disease. Stress made that worse. And he certainly was very protective about his time in his later years. And so it may well have been a combination. But anyway.
So what do people think there on that? We've had a few responses there. Actually, I noticed there's someone in the chat who suggested that there's no all of the above button.
Yeah.
So perhaps we should have had an option D there to suggest that all of the above. So, okay, maybe that's what people have selected. That part of it. So a lot of people have gone with the Chagas disease, and yeah, it seems so. But I guess at the time, no one could really. There was probably no doctor in England, or who would have known enough to actually be able to diagnose that and say, well, this is that disease, because it was such an unusual thing, and not many people went to South America and travelled there and so on. So that people just didn't know what it was, probably.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we'll probably never know the answer to that question, but maybe the missing D, all of the above, is probably the best answer.
Might be the one. Might be the best answer. So yeah, and obviously there was a bit his stress with his belief, I suppose, and obviously he's still a very firm believer in understanding and so on. So that probably would have...
yeah, one of the bits of it, there's actually been a book written about that. Specifically one. And Tim Barrett talks about that idea in his book about one sort of bit of circumstantial evidence that might support the stress-related answers is that in his later years, at least in the scientific community, his ideas were pretty well accepted in his later years, and his health actually got improved as he got older, and so maybe he sort of weathered that storm and
a little more comfortable with
the idea, and you know, a lot of he didn't actually, although the controversy continued and continues today, but he had other, you know, Huxley and other colleagues that actually took up the fight on his behalf, and so he was pretty much sort of left or to some extent left out of that, the worst of that anyway.
And can continue his pursuits down house. That's right, he didn't really leave down house that much, and he didn't get involved terribly much in all the controversy that followed, particularly the publication of the Origin, wasn't it? So, one more question we thought, and so in terms of Darwin, so we mentioned that he travelled around, he became, you know, some say became the complete naturalist in terms of he had an interest in a whole range of different things, and I think it's interesting to think that in those days people could really encompass almost, you know, all of which was known type of thing. Like if they read widely and so on, they could understand geology, they could understand whole areas of zoology, they could even things like meteorology were part of natural history. Astronomy to a certain extent, although that was a bit specialised, a bit of its own thing, but it was all part of natural history. And so these people were doing natural science, who were doing natural history, didn't necessarily think of themselves as scientists as such, certainly not in the way that we think of scientists these days. And it was, I mean, not easy, but easier to be a generalist in those days. These days, when everything's very specific, you know, you work on a specific organism or you work in a specific area of science. Science is so broad and so massive, you know, biology is just an enormous field. Thousands of different scientific journals. It's basically impossible to keep abreast of absolutely everything. But Darwin did use lots of different types of evidence, and as we mentioned, he accumulated evidence over time. The whole time he was writing and keeping notes in his diary and you know, notebooks and all those sorts of things. So just a sort of general question then about, you know, what type of evidence. So acknowledging that you know, it's a combination of those things, so that would be the option. And acknowledging that, what do you think? What are the sort of types of evidence that are really, really important in developing that evolutionary theory? So we've had some responses. We give them the 5-second warning. 5, 4. Oh, no, my timing's out. My timing's terrible. So let's see what people think about that. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, actually, I would agree with that.
Pretty much agree with that?
Definitely between zoology and geology. No. Darwin became, he obviously was a bit of a botanist. He collected a lot of plant specimens during the voyage.
Yeah.
But and then later in life, he published books and books you know, on orchids and on climbing plants and did a lot of botany. But that was really after the theory had been put out, and it was in his later years, like in the 1870s, he really became much of a botanist. So zoology and geology, he was always a zoologist, and both of those, you know, fields are very important to him. It's interesting to note that when he came back from the voyage, he farmed out a lot of his specimens to specialists. John Gould got the birds, other people got the mammals, and fish and amphibians. He kept the plants, so I guess that's one of our decisions. He wasn't interested in botany then, but he kept the plants, all the invertebrate animals, and the rocks. So again, he A, B, and C, he was really right across
everything. Yeah, I mean, I think I probably would have gone zoologist number one. I mean, that's partly because that's my preference. But I think he was really interested in animals. He started looking at invertebrates when he was young.
Yep.
He was interested in birds.
Yep.
And a lot of his explanations are used, like he talks about domesticated animals, so he was breeding pigeons, all those sorts of things.
So I'll say the comment here about the finches stood out, and that the finches were obviously very important, but it's interesting that it took him a while to realize how important the finches were, because when he collected finches, and other members of the crew collected finches, he didn't actually even record which islands the finches came from. So he collected a bunch of islands, and it was years later, so he gave the finches to John Gould he didn't recognize them as finches.
Some of them didn't even think they were finches.
He called them different things. John Gould pointed out, oh, these are all finches.
Yeah.
And he had to go back to the captain's Fitzroy's notes to sort out which islands the different finches came from. And so the finches are obviously very important to his theory, development of his theory, but it took him a while to realize that. It certainly wasn't something that jumped at him out in what was there.
And then Fitzroy kept better notes than he did in terms of which island they'd come from. He didn't really know which island they'd come from. So he wasn't thinking in those terms at all. Otherwise we've taken very specific notes about this came from this island.
Yeah.
So that was actually there's an interesting caveat to that I was reading recently that suggests that actually some of the finches, or all the finches, might not be finches, but they might actually be closely related to tanagers, which is a related group of birds in South America. But let's not go there. But the other thing I wanted to mention is let's not forget the barnacles, because Darwin spent about 8 years describing every known species of barnacle, looking at fossil barnacles. This was great. In the introduction of taxonomy, he took a whole group and studied it in great detail. He might have spent a little bit longer than he planned.
Yeah, I think the barnacles were really important too. And one of the things that we'll talk about in part 2 next week when we start looking at the mechanisms of evolution is the fact that there's variation within a species. And so we all recognize that people all look different, but we'd probably consider that all barnacles of a particular species are all pretty much the same. Some might be a bit bigger than others. But when you start looking at them and spend 8 years looking at them, like Darwin did, you realize that even within a species, there's a lot of variation. And so that's the sort of evidence that he was collecting over his long career.
Yeah. So the other thing is really the geology. And I think someone's mentioned there about his ideas on the growth of atolls. So that's right. He actually published, he was a member of the Geological Society, he published a range of articles. He published the geological researches from the voyage of the Beagle in several volumes. So he had theories on coral reef growth. He had publications on volcanic islands, because they visited a lot of volcanic islands. And he also had a lot to say about the geological structures of South America and so on. So in some ways, at least initially, he was a geologist in a lot of ways. I think one thing I just sort of wanted to point out was, so this is an aerial view of South America. And there you can see the Andes Mountains along the west coast. And one of his theories was this incremental upthrust theory. And having seen the volcano and then the earthquake in Concepcion, and he saw places there where the coast had been lifted. In some cases just by a few feet, but in some cases, more several meters or 10 feet, this sort of thing. And in some cases with shells still attached to the rocks that have been lifted out of the. And so I think, as he mentions here, it's hardly possible to doubt that this great elevation has been affected by successive small uprisings. And he was part of this was this incremental theory that this had happened in small stages, but also it would have made him think during the voyage, gosh, that must have taken a long time, because the earthquake happened when he was there. No one could remember an earthquake like that in living history, so you think that might happen every few hundred years. And if that rises, a couple of meters, if the Andes themselves are several thousand meters high, you're starting to think about at least hundreds of thousands of years at the very least. And in actual fact, now, we think the Andes is probably 10 million years old, or possibly older. So I started to think about periods of time. But the other thing was that he noticed a lot of fossils.
Yeah, so as he travelled in there, he didn't go all the way to the top of the Andes, but he went pretty high up. And he found marine fossils, and so I just brought my prop for the day, is an ammonite.
I've only got a little shell. I've got a little fossil shell here.
So he found marine fossils and other kinds of fossils like petrified wood and other things that were obviously had been under the sea at some stage, all the way up to as high as 7,000 feet. So for those of you in Australia, that's roughly the height of Mount Kosciuszko, the highest point in Australia. So if you can imagine going up to snowfields and Mount Kosciuszko and finding marine fossils, and not just one or two, but lots of them.
Old beds fossils.
And not just laying there, but layers of them. And so this obviously was very important to his thinking. He realized, like he said, that the Earth was pretty old, maybe a lot older than a lot of people were thinking at the time, and that it was dynamic. Things were changing, things were moving around.
And the geological ideas, I think, so as I say, he was very much a gradualist. I think those ideas, and also sort of came into his evolutionary theory as well. So.
Yeah. So I got the question about what's his take on plate tectonics. I don't think we know the answer to that specifically. I mean, I think the important information that he did go was that it was dynamic. Things were changing. So I don't think if someone had, I think the idea of plate tectonics came much later.
Much later, yeah.
But if someone had explained it, had shown it to him, he wouldn't have said, "Oh, that's crazy." I think he would, he would have thought, "Wow, that really explains a lot."
He might have at least considered it. He would have definitely thought about it. It wasn't really until the 1930s that they're going to talk about plate tectonics, and much later that became widely accepted.
Yeah.
So that was a long time after Darwin's time. Okay, so we have had some discussions on the forum, and that's great. We've had a few people talk about a few things that may be important to mention in Darwin's life that maybe we didn't mention on the timelines or that we haven't gone into. One of them was Erasmus, his grandfather, so not the brother Raz, the other one. And so Darwin would have read Zoonomia when he was young, and there was talk in there about some evolutionary laws, anyway, some evolutionary ideas, maybe that things could change. So which was actually unusual at the time. So even the possibility that could happen, maybe thought Darwin, and the family were free thinkers, so they were starting to think of new ideas and outside sort of the establishment. So the Zoonomia was important. Some people have mentioned the Plinian Society when Darwin was at Edinburgh, and so this was a group where they would get together and talk about items of natural science and read papers. And so I guess maybe that helped Darwin. Maybe his first paper was read before the Plinian Society, so that was his first entree, I guess. So that perhaps was important. There's been a few people mentioned that. And the other one at Edinburgh was Robert Grant, who was interested in marine invertebrates and sponges, but generally Darwin was collecting marine invertebrates from the Firth of Forth, so the estuary at Edinburgh there, and so he started his interest there in natural history as well. Another one that's come up several times is the death of Annie Darwin, and so this has been depicted in a movie, or this has been as an important thing in its movie creation. I'm not sure if they did that a little bit, but basically Annie was his oldest daughter, and she lived she died when she was 10 years old, and I think it had a particularly strong effect on Darwin because, she was very lively, she was full of life, maybe his favourite daughter, I don't know. So,
she died of tuberculosis.
Well, she got a fever and she never recovered, and so his had other children that did die, but I think this was particularly bad. First she lived for 10 years, she looked like she'd survived. He took it particularly badly, and I think he was already losing his sort of belief in a sense, and I think that was, some people think that was like the final straw for Darwin. It was like there's no merciful anything, this is just, life is just as it is. Something I thought that was important that maybe didn't come out that much was Darwin's father, and someone mentioned that he allowed him to go on the voyage, and I suppose he did, but also I think financially supporting Darwin. He actually paid for him to go on the voyage. He was sending him money so he could travel. When he came back, He gave him money to help him buy down a house. You know, he basically supported him the whole time. So if his father hadn't been, you know, well off, you know, a doctor, then I don't think Darwin would have had the life that he had.
Yeah. His father allowed him, but it was only after his father. He put the proposal to his father, and his father said, "Well, if you can get the word of one good man who said this is a really good idea, then I'll agree to it." And Darwin went to his uncle, who was just out of Wedgwood, I think, definitely a Wedgwood, and his uncle and his father were, you know, held each other in high regard, and so his uncle thought it was a great idea, and so his uncle wrote a letter to Darwin's father, and that was the sort of seed.
I think he realised that Darwin, you know, that's really what he wanted to do, and that's where his passion lay. So his father wanted him to do medicine, he wanted to or do something useful with his life, I suppose. So he was a bit of a wayward child, perhaps. So the other ones I just sort of wanted to mention briefly was Darwin's brother Raz. So when they were young, you know, they used to do some experiments in chemistry and so on, and maybe that helped Darwin get a little interest in experiments and science. But also later in London, his brother introduced him to certain aspects of London society, which might have made Darwin, you know, you wonder about the sorts of conversations that people might have had, you know, about society and about how things were changing. You know, the whole, you know, a lot of things were changing in the world at that time. So that, I think, also would have had a bit of influence. And lastly, early on, William Fox got Darwin interested in collecting beetles, and beetles became an absolute fascination for Darwin. You know, he probably should have been studying. He was out collecting beetles. And this is interesting too, because when we look at Wallace in part 3, he also was a very avid beetle collector, so it must have been quite thin for people to be into collecting beetles. Well,
one thing about beetles is they come in all sizes, but a lot of them are reasonably good size. You don't necessarily have to have a microscope to look at. They're incredibly diverse, and they're even in England, which is not the hotspot of diversity in the world, but there are a lot of beetles everywhere, and so it gives, I think, having an appreciation of that early on probably influenced him later in life to see how diverse life is on Earth.
That's right, that whole idea of diversity. And then when he went to the tropics, he would have been absolutely amazed to see how many beetles were there and butterflies and all manner of insects. The other thing we've had is that someone mentioned Alexander von Humboldt's personal narrative. So the personal narrative of a journey to the equinoctial regions of the new continent, which was someone, Humboldt went there very early on, explored in South America, and Henslow, I think, suggested that Darwin read Humboldt's personal narrative, and this is one of the things that inspired him to go, I want to go and travel, I want to go and see these places. So just the idea of travel, and he was interested in natural history, but made him actually wanted to go to those places and visit them. So I think that was pretty important. So someone mentioned that one. A couple of other things, I guess. So Darwin had his own readings, if you like, at Cambridge. Herschel's preliminary discourse on the study of natural philosophy, which was explaining ideas of natural science as it was known at the time. And I think this was when Darwin said he wanted to contribute anything, just something to natural science. So maybe he wanted to contribute something to that. But also Herschel expressed the idea of experience as a source of knowledge. So because there was ideas that back in those days, you didn't actually have to do experiments, you just had to read things and come up with a theory, where he was saying, no, you really need to experience things so that you can know about them. So that was kind of an interesting idea, and so it probably helped Darwin wanted to contribute to some science. And the other thing was Paley's natural theology, which Darwin read and was actually quite interested in, and had a sort of different explanation from what Darwin later came up with about how organisms come about, and he talked about design and those sorts of ideas. So Darwin actually did enjoy reading those things at the time, and it had some influence on him, but he would ultimately go completely against the sorts of ideas that Paley was suggesting. So
I'll just make a comment about that, Darwin and his experiments, particularly later in life when he did really detailed experiments with plants and how they move and so on and so forth. These were particularly well thought out experiments, and he coined the phrase of a control for an experiment, an experimental control, and so that it's a contribution to science that is really not widely acknowledged to be something that Darwin did. But the idea of doing a very careful experiment, one that can be interpreted, needs a control, and so that was another contribution that he made to science.
Yeah, that's like a fundamental of designing experiments, isn't it? Absolutely fundamental. So we thought we'd try one more quiz. We've just got a quick one here. So we've talked about a few people who have been influential on Darwin. We talked about his life and his growing up and so on. So a few people we picked out here. So obviously Henslow, Darwin's botany professor, but also really just interested in natural history and all aspects of natural history at the time. So Darwin would go in with all sorts of questions, and they had discussions, and he became the manual books with Henslow. Joseph Hooker, so he was a botanist, but he was a colleague, but also a lot of correspondence. They were sort of good friends, really. So some of his early ideas when he was writing about transmutation and so on, he expressed these to Hooker. So he could tell them, he needed a sounding board, he needed someone he could talk to about these things or write to. So he was important as well. So Charles Lyell, we've mentioned, so he's reading Lyell's Principles of Geology. That was very important. And also, you mentioned Thomas.
Yeah, as I said, nothing about Lyell. I mean, he read Lyell's book while he was on the voyage, and so it got him to thinking about geological time frames. Yeah. But then when he came back, almost immediately when he came back from the voyage, he was introduced to Lyell, joined the Geological Society, and he and Lyell also became friends, and so they were correspondents. And Lyell was older than Darwin, but he lived to quite an old age, and they corresponded as well a lot. Huxley, he's called as Darwin's bulldog, and he was a staunch defender. And that's a read. Maybe I'll say a bit more after the vote.
Should we see what people think? What have we got there? See, I think Darwin was pretty excited when he actually finally met Lyell. He felt like he was becoming a part of that whole society of scientists or natural scientists at the time. So meeting Lyell would have been pretty big. Okay. So what have we got? So actually, a lot of Henslow.
Firstly, not so much Huxley. Yeah, that's actually again I would agree with that. I mean, I think Huxley was very important to the
sort of
defending it and sort of getting the idea out and defending it, both publicly and among scientists. I mean, but among scientists and to the broader public. But probably less important to this question is influential in his ideas. So, whereas Henslow suggested him as going on as the naturalist for the voyage of the people. So if that hadn't happened, well, this life would have been very different. So he's pretty important. And then, as you mentioned, Hooker was a sounding board, and they corresponded literally thousands of letters exchanged. It was sort of the text messages of the day.
Every day.
Letters. And then we just talked about Lyell. So I think all three of those are important. Huxley was important to the dissemination of the idea, but not so much to the development of the idea.
Promoters and everything you need. Yeah. So someone's mentioned actually on the chat about Lamarck and his philosophy, zoology. So Lamarck was a Frenchman, and that's right. And he promoted the idea of transmutation and suggested, really for Darwin, this idea that things could evolve. So and I think Darwin definitely would have been aware of Lamarck, and so again he might have thought of that transmutation was possible at least. So the possibility would have been there, but the mechanism obviously that Darwin came up with was different to what. But look, Lamarck actually wrote on a whole range of issues, and I think just to pull out the whole quiet characteristics thing is, and it's a really interesting book actually. The Lamarck's in English we'd say philosophical zoology. So okay, one last little quick quiz. Now everyone should be an expert by now. So quick quiz. one more poll. So, in what year was The Origin of Species first published? So, it's when it first came out. So, what can we say? Darwin was 50 years old when it was published, so that might be a clue. So, and it was a bit over 20 years since he came back. So we're talking actually quite a long time between when he came back from the voyage and started to write about transmutation in his notebooks, 20-something years before he finally got around to actually publishing it. As we'll see in part 3, got some provoked into it, if you like, from Wallace.
So he originally planned a much bigger, I mean, it's a big book, but he refers to it as sort of the abstract, the short version of what he really planned to write. And so that's part of the reason. We'll talk about next week and subsequent weeks, sort of what spurred him on to get it out a bit quicker and end up with this 400 or 500 page book instead of a 2,000 page book.
It's probably long enough. So, okay, we've got most people have responded now, have we? Now let's see what results we got here. I think that's the time up. I think the other thing I'd like to point out here is that the 150th anniversary was only a few years ago, wasn't it?
2009, yeah.
So what have people said?
Oh, yeah, it must be right.
And let's see what it says down here. Publication date. You can see that 1859. Yeah. So pretty much everyone got that, did they?
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh, a couple more. Still pretty good.
Yeah, most of
the people got that. That's great. That means it's everyone's learning stuff. So, okay, we're getting towards the end of the webinar now. So, just one other item from the forum. Someone mentioned the megatherium, and so at Punta Alta in South America, Darwin found a whole group of fossil bones, and actually of a range of different species. And one of these was megatherium. Someone noticed that one of the photos in the timeline wasn't a megatherium, and what it is it's actually a different species of ground sloth. And actually, there was a whole range of these ground sloths, large. They were part of the megafauna at the time. Several genera, a whole group of species. So megatherium was just one of those, and these were one of the things at the time people were starting to find a lot more fossil animals, and big fossil animals that they knew didn't exist anymore. A great big thing like a woolly mammoth or a mastodon or something, you can't just miss those. They must be around. If they still existed, people would know they existed. So this was suggesting that, okay, things really had gone extinct. So there was a range of these Pleistocene megafauna, so living in the last couple of million years sort of thing. And so in Australia we had, big fossils now. We had big great big wombats, we had enormous goannas, as big as a crocodile, big as a smaller crocodile.
Huge kangaroos.
Yeah, enormous kangaroos, even bigger than the ones we see today. Marsupial lion. And in various parts of the world there were these megafauna, and a lot of them went extinct, probably only some of them only last 10,000 to 20,000 years. Yeah. So really in comparatively recent times. So that was just an example of something that Darwin did find, and again would have made him think a bit more about what happened to these things. And
yeah, I think he was surprised when he came back from the voyage that he found this almost complete skeleton and shipped it back. And when he got there, it had been on display. He was sort of famous just for that one thing.
And a bit of a celebrity.
Megatherium. Finding that fossil.
Yeah. So it was really, raising people's awareness, I think. So, okay, just then, so we're getting towards the end now, I think. So just to conclude, really, so we've spoken this week about we've broken up into 3 phases of Darwin's life. You could probably break it up into more phases if you like. But I think just to really say that, Darwin really was a product of his times. So, partly his lifestyle, but if you think about the intellectual climate at the time, I mean, we're a product of the society we live in, and, nowadays we use computers and we can search the internet and find information at the touch of a button. Darwin had to spend a lot of time reading and pondering and, writing letters to people and those sorts of things. So he did it in different ways. then we perhaps might do that sort of research these days. And I think also that Darwin's ideas have obviously affected a lot the way we think in terms of how we think of ourselves, as part of nature, or the organic world, and really it's revolutionised biology in the sense that it just gives so much greater understanding of all kinds of biological processes.
So next week we'll get into the mechanisms of how it actually works, and so a bit more biology, some history, talk about not only Darwin's ideas, but all these other people's ideas, both before and since, after Darwin, so the evolution of the idea of evolution, and then you'll talk a bit about the mechanisms of evolution by natural selection.
Yeah. And so there's a couple of discussion forums for part 2. So by all means, post some things on the discussion forums. Have a look there and see what people are saying. Get involved. And I guess we'll see you for the next webinar, which, as I mentioned, will be next Friday. And we'll talk about evolution, natural selection, and speciation, and so on. So same Darwin time, same Darwin channel. See you next week, and we'll just leave you with this final quote from Darwin, an origin quote, and we'll see you then. There's a menu and there's a polling response box there, and actually most of ours will be multiple choice, so A, B, C, or A, B, C, D. So give us your response. We'll give you a little bit of time to respond, and then we'll publish the responses to see what people think. All right. So what have we covered this week? So hopefully people have looked at the timeline. So we've had Darwin's life, his early life, the voyage of the Beagle, travelling around the world, and also when he came back from his journey. We've also had some readings from the Journal of Researchers. So part of that is fossil megafauna that Darwin found, but also his description of the Galapagos, so the islands, the landscapes, and some of the animals and so on. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Galapagos in part 2, so next week. And the other thing is the Beagle voyages and how Port Darwin and Darwin, where we are, came to be named. So hopefully everyone's had a look at that. One thing we just wanted to say was that there's a lot of books available on Darwin. One that I would particularly recommend is this one, which is Charles Darwin, part of the Very Interesting People series. So he was a very interesting person. And it's written by Adrian Desmond, James Moore, and Janet Brown. So they're all very well-renowned Darwin scholars. So for a short, readable introduction, and this one is interesting in terms of a lot of the social context as well to what was happening at the time in England. I definitely recommend this one. It's easy to get hold of. You can just order it online or whatever. Keith, you had a... Yep,
I'd like to recommend one, a different one that's different but similar in some ways. Also very concise. In fact, so concise that it has concise in the title. The title is Charles Darwin, The Concise Story of an Extraordinary Man, and that's by Professor Tim Berra. And Tim Berra is at Ohio State University. But he spent quite a bit of time here in Darwin, both at the museum in Darwin and more recently at the Charles Darwin University. So it's a good overview, very readable, lots of nice illustrations and pictures, and so it's a very good way to get a lot of information about Darwin very quickly.
And Tim gives an interesting lecture on Charles Darwin as well, which is available online. You can find that, and there's a link to it on the MOOC. So we thought we would start. So we want to test out the polling. So what we would like is, the question is,
can you repeat the author?
Oh, so we've had a question here.
Okay, I'll repeat the concise story of an extraordinary man. Tim Berra, B-E-R-R-A, B-E-R-R-A.
Yeah.
I think maybe they're asking about both of them.
I'm asking about this one as well. This one is just called Charles Darwin by Adrian Desmond. just like to briefly introduce myself. We're coming to you from Darwin, the Northern Territory of Australia. I'm Dr. Steve Reynolds. I'm a lecturer and researcher here at Charles Darwin University, and I'm a zoologist. My main interest is actually in amphibians, but I'm work on ecology and also physiology, so ecophysiology. And of course I have an interest in biogeography because of the region we're in Australia, particularly close to Southeast Asia, and also have a bit of interest in taxonomy. And I'd also like to introduce...
I'm Professor Keith Christian. I'm a zoologist here, also a zoologist here at Charles Darwin University. My research interests are with amphibians and reptiles, the physiology and ecology, but of course evolution is the background for all of that, and it's sort of the backbone of all the research we do. I've had a long-standing interest in Darwin and evolution. In fact, I did my PhD research work in the Galapagos Islands way back in the late 1970s. And so I'm really pleased to be here and help Steve out today. Okay,
so as most of you hopefully have realised by now, the course is really composed of 4 parts. So hopefully you've had a little bit of a look around the site, and particularly noted part 1 this week. So what we'll do with the webinars is each Friday we'll have a webinar and we'll focus on that part. So then James Moore and Janet Brown, and it's part of the very interesting People series by Oxford University Press. So it's published in England by Oxford University Press. All right, so we'll try the first poll. So this is just sort of a general question about Darwin. I guess in a way, if you thought, if I was Darwin, which part of his life do you think would appeal to you most? Which would be the most interesting or exciting? Which would interest you? So Darwin lived for quite a while. He lived until he was 73 years old. The voyage was an important part in the middle there, 5 years from 1831 to 1836. So really, which period of Darwin's life do you think, would you rather be out adventuring in South America, or would you be sort of like to be comfortable down the house? Or maybe his early life was quite interesting. So people have made some votes. We'll give you a few more seconds. So 5-second warning. Oh, the time is timed out. 4, 3. Okay, so let's see what people thought. So there's some responses. So we've got, what have we got? Looks like the Beagles done pretty well. Yeah. So a few people like the early life. Well, okay. I think so. This is so Darwin. This week we're going to focus on part 1. At the end of next week on Friday, we'll focus on part 2, and so on. So this week, obviously, we want to talk about the life of Charles Darwin. So with the webinars, so a few things we'd like to do. Firstly, just talk about some points of interest relating to part 1. So hopefully you've already read through part 1 on the quiz and so on, and we'll just cover some other points of interest, maybe some things we didn't cover necessarily in part 1. Also want to provide some opportunities to interact and participate. So we'll have some questions, so you can respond to those questions with polling, and also a bit of live chat, so you can send us some chat at any time, and we'll be monitoring that during the webinar. So, and the other thing we'd like to do is that we've had some discussions on the discussion forum this week, and we'd like to look at some of the items and some of the issues and so on that have come out of that discussion forum. So. Just while we're on that, so hopefully, I think most people have figured this out already, but you can communicate using the chat, and so use the chat box there to write anything and press enter when you want to send a bit of chat, and we'll keep an eye on that. The other thing is for the polling. So what we'll do is we'll have a couple of questions, some activities during the webinar, and to participate, go to the box, so you can see here, there's the